Hi everybody and welcome to Different Leaf, a show for new and experienced cannabis consumers. I'm Britt Smith. This week we're going to delve into the issue of how adults can talk to young people about making healthy choices when it comes to cannabis. The current generation of teenagers are really living in a very different world of weed than any that have come before them. They're the first young people to be able to try discreet smelling THC vape pens. They're the first teens regularly seeing billboards for marijuana delivery services. And soon they'll be the first generation of young adults who will plan to hit the pot shop instead of or as well as the bar or liquor store on their 21st birthdays. They might even have a family member who openly consumes or works in legal marijuana. So how has legalization affected teenagers' views of weed over the past decade? How can adults have ongoing conversations and empower their curious kids to think about their substance use choices? And how can parents really connect with their teens to discuss the impact of cannabis consumption on young brains? Our guest this week is Dr. Elizabeth DAmicos from the RAND Corporation, a non-profit research organization that develops solutions to public policy challenges. Dr. DAmicos is also an adjunct professor at UCLA's School of Public Health, and she's a mother of two who is nationally recognized for her work on predictors, consequences, and interventions surrounding adolescent substance use. We'll be back with Dr. DAmicos after this quick break. Thank you so much for joining me, Dr. DAmicos. Can you start by just telling us a little bit about your background and what your research is right now?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me today. It's nice to be able to talk with you. I am Senior Behavioral Scientist at RAND Corporation. I'm also a licensed clinical psychologist. And for the past 20 years, I've been doing work focused on developing and implementing and testing drug and alcohol interventions for teens.
So in your work, you've been focused a lot on prevention and prediction for teen use. What do we know so far about the impact of cannabis on teen brains?
There's a lot of research out there, and I think we're still learning quite a bit. One of the experts in the field is Dr. Susan Tapert, who's done a lot of research using fMRI. But what we do know is that during this time frame, the teen brain is still developing. And so use of any substances during this time can affect how the brain develops. So some of her work has shown, for example, that when teens use cannabis regularly, it tends to affect, for example, the hippocampus or the memory part of the brain. And the reason why that matters is that can have long-term implications, right? So for example, if the memory part of your brain is changed, that can affect how well you do in school because maybe you can't remember things. And so that's what some of her work has shown.
Is there anything that shows there's some sort of correlation between cannabis use and any sort of mental illness like depression or anxiety? And do we sort of know which way that link might go?
I think that's a very difficult question to answer, quite honestly. I think a lot of the research has shown that oftentimes when people have depression or anxiety, they may be more likely to use substances like cannabis. And similarly, when people use substances like cannabis, they might experience more anxiety or depression. So I know I don't think there's an easy answer, unfortunately.
We're still working on that one.
Yeah, I think it's hard. I know there's a lot of longitudinal work being done now to try to understand that using brain imaging over time. To look at how what is in the brain affects maybe what happens later, and then how things people do affect the brain. So I think, we're still trying to understand all of that.
That part's really interesting to me, and I definitely want to keep an eye on that research. I'm somebody who used cannabis as a teenager, from 14, 15 years old, pretty regularly until I left England and came over to the US, and I was 19, and I stopped then. So it was most of my teenage life. And then into my mid-20s, I had addiction issues with lots of different substances. And I've always been interested in whether we could have predicted that I would have addiction issues as an adult by the fact that I was using it so young. I think we'll probably get into some of that research a little bit later on. But for the moment, I want to stick with what teens think about pot at the moment. So there's been some research I was reading up on what you've done that shows that teenagers and adolescents at the moment don't seem to think that cannabis is very dangerous for them or is not more dangerous for them than alcohol and tobacco. Is it true? And why do they think that?
Well, I'm really glad you brought that up because I think that's an important point for prevention. I think that the way that weed is marketed is very different in the way that people think about it versus, say, alcohol. Most people and teens understand that, and again, these are legal substances. I'm not saying they're bad. It's how they get used, kind of like what you were saying when you were a teen, right? But I think most people would agree that if you drink and get into a car, that can be very dangerous. I think the campaigns around weed haven't been as clear about that. And so we really are trying to educate people that, yes, it can be dangerous if you use that substance and get into a car. And I think the fact that you bring this up, I can tell you, I was contacted by a teen about 6 months ago in another state who was very interested in this research for a personal reason. And he had read a lot of the work on this. And he said, you know, in his experience, weed had really been a drug that was presented as harmless and non-addictive. And in his own words, he says, you know, I quickly found that to be fiction. And he said that he was struggling with withdrawal, short-term memory loss, and other things. He said, you know, I was still doing okay in school, still playing my sport and everything, but I just didn't feel right and something was wrong. And he said he finally got help from his parents. And one of the things he said was just the potency of the weed and just not understanding and how it was so normalized in his friend group and at his school that, oh, it's just something you do. And he just said, I really want to let teens know that it can be addictive and it is very strong and it can create problems for you in your life. And I just thought that was really powerful for someone so young to have experienced that and then be able to reach out for help and get that and be able to stop using.
It definitely has changed over the decades. The potency, anybody that I've spoken to who smoked back in the day has said that the legal weed knocks them on their butts. They often can't take more than a puff or two. And it's definitely got more THC. That's why folks are breeding it this way. And as you said, there's already some studies that are showing that THC for adolescent brains, at least, is detrimental. What age range do we call up until adolescent? Is it in the early 20s?
Well, I mean, I think, again, you're asking really important but difficult questions. I think, you know, adolescence, people define it differently. We know the brain is still developing until age 25. We know substances are legal at age 21. And some people choose not to use also. It's not like, oh, I'm 21, I'm going to start using all of a sudden. And we know that people use when they're younger as well. And so really what we try to tell people is just thinking through how to make healthy choices, right? And definitely using substances before age 21 is not a good idea because we know that's when a lot of development is going on. People can choose to use after they're 21. And what we try to think about is responsible use, right? Like with anything. Are people having a social glass of wine with dinner or are people drinking a case of beer? And those have different consequences and implications. And so I think what we try to do in our prevention is really help teens think ahead about when they're going to get exposure to substances, which happens all the time. We know that. And how they're going to make a choice about where they want to be in the future and whether they want to use. And I think for a lot of teens, nobody wants to end up like this teen that I talked to with memory loss, depression, anxiety. Nobody wants that. That's not why people use. And so we really try to talk with them about, well, why do people start to use and what happens and how do they go down that path where they get to problem use, right? Because that's not where people want to be. Let's think about the choices you make before you get there so you don't go there. So just delaying initiation, right? Let's just delay it till your brain's developed. Those are some of the things that we talk about.
What are some of the ideas that you bring to teens and I guess also to parents who want to talk about this subject with their teens about slowing down and not sort of jumping into just because it's legalized and you've just turned 21 or you can even get it from a friend before you're 21?
Well, right. And I think it's pretty easy to get substances if you really want to find them. People can find them. I think That's another issue with access. But you know, what I tell parents is really talk to your teens openly about it. It's not just a 1 hour conversation where you're going to show your teen a PowerPoint slide about this is marijuana. It's really everyday conversations that you have. I'm a mom also and a researcher, and I've been talking to my kids about it since they were little, and it's just developmentally appropriate, you know, and it starts seeing a billboard that says cannabis, you know, do you know what that is? What are the effects? And just making sure your kids and your teens feel comfortable asking you questions. And if you don't know the answer, that's okay. You can go look it up. There's a ton of information out there. And so I think sometimes as parents, we worry, oh, I may not know the answer. And you can tell your teen that, like, you know, I'm not sure. Why don't we go look at it together, you know, and use it as kind of a learning experience together.
Yeah, I guess parents really are facing this new world, especially this generation of parents. There's never been one before that had to deal with billboards of cannabis, and it's on social media, and celebrities are sponsoring cannabis brands now. And a lot of those same celebrities are like the pop stars that kids like to listen to. And how do you discuss with adolescents, because it can start before teenage years, about legalization and how it came to be and sort of the whole story of cannabis?
It's something we've dealt with for a long time with other substances, right? Cigarettes are legal, alcohol is legal, and cannabis is legal. And just because something's legal doesn't mean that it's safe, right? And so again, it's thinking through, I mean, caffeine is legal, right?
Yeah, right.
We all know like what happens if you drink too much of that. That's not good either. So again, I think it's teaching people how to think about these substances. And if you are legal and you're going to use them, how do you use them responsibly? So you don't end up in a car with someone maybe who's been using, or you yourself, and then you end up in an accident, or you use, you know, start using more regularly and it starts to cause other problems like memory loss. I think that it's really just a lot of education around it. Also being realistic. People use substances socially. Again, it's not a bad thing. If it's legal, it's how you're using it. And I think sometimes we forget about that. And so at least when I talk to my teens, I don't talk about how substances are bad, because they're not. It's how they get used, and really empowering them to think about their choices and what it means for them.
Yeah, I like the take on it being sort of amongst an array of different substances that you can do bad with, including, you know, caffeine, sugar, tobacco, alcohol, any of those things. When I was a kid, there were certain drugs that were, these are okay. And then there were certain drugs, these are not okay. And cannabis was in there with ecstasy and LSD. And then there were sort of the everyday use drugs that you might see adults using, but they're still really bad for you. And those are, you know, liquor and cigarettes and cigars. And now there's sort of this new category of like adults use this and it's not always good for you, but sometimes it is good for you. And sometimes it's even medicine. It's such a complex thing. I've been trying to talk to a 9-year-old I know about this, and she's asking so many questions. And I'm just sort of like, how deep do I really get with you at this age, you know?
That's a really great point too, because I think you got to think about the age, right? And how much information is developmentally appropriate. So the way you're going to talk to a 9-year-old is going to be different than a 14-year-old in terms of the amount of information. The other point you bring up is that cannabis was introduced medically, and we know that it can help people for some medical conditions. However, we also know that it's getting promoted medically for conditions for which there may not be evidence. And so that's where the confusion comes in. And so again, I encourage parents to look up the information. There's a huge report out there that the National Academy put out that explains like what it's used for. It can really help people, for example, who have cancer, who have nausea. But that is a different type of cannabis than the cannabis that you were talking about, this potent THC. And I think, I don't know if a 9-year-old would get all of that at that level. I think a 14-year-old would.
Yeah.
A lot of teens, they like science. It's very sciencey. You know, how does it affect my brain? What does it look like? And those are some of the things in my programming that we do as well, because they love that. They're like, oh, where does it go in my brain? What happens? And oh, I didn't realize that it was going to affect this. And what does that mean for me in terms of like the goals that I have in my future if it's affecting this part of my brain? Again, it's giving people information to help them think about the choices they make.
Yeah, making it tangible like that. It's definitely important when you're communicating with adolescents, because I remember being a teenager and somebody telling me not to do something. And I was like, why? Because you tell me not to? Like, that's not really a good enough reason for some teens. So, I mean, yeah, making it science-based, making it something that like, I've actually got a stake in this and I want to know if this is going to impact me later on. That's a really good way of connecting with them.
Well, and you bring up another really excellent point, which is who likes getting told what to do, right? Raise your hand.
Yeah.
No one. And so a lot of our work is based on motivational interviewing, which is really empowering people to think about their choices. And honestly, some people may not be ready to make a change in their behavior, and that's okay. And our goal is to provide information to people, talk with them about it, and they have to decide what's going to be right for them. But I can tell you from my work and even work that I've done in primary care with just a brief 15-minute intervention with teens who, and what's interesting is these teens screened in for drinking. But I can tell you from listening to all the tapes that over probably 90% of them were also regularly using cannabis. And so in a 15-minute conversation, you're talking with them, why are you using? What do you like? What don't you like? If you keep using in this way, what might happen? And it gets them thinking about the choices they're making. There's no judgment there.
Yeah.
And what's amazing to me is in that 15 minutes, you can have a teen who's reporting how they're regularly using. And by the end, they're like, maybe I might want to cut back. And we know this is effective because our research has shown a year later, the teens who got this intervention reported less cannabis use, less alcohol use, and fewer consequences from using. So just intervening before people get down this pathway and help them think about their choices can be really impactful.
That's a really empowering way to put it. That's sort of the reason that I, as an adult, wanted to stop, because somebody asked me to reflect on my use and think like, how much do I use? Why do I use it? What do I feel when I use it? And why wouldn't you be the exact same way as a teen? You're sort of still using for almost the same reasons. You like the euphoria, you like the social aspects, whatever it is. But if you give them the opportunity to reflect on, does this really serve me? Actually, I make up my own mind that maybe it doesn't, or maybe it doesn't in these amounts, or, just gives them a little leeway to step back a bit.
Exactly. And they have to figure out for themselves, how does this fit with where I want to be? And I think that, as you said earlier, no one likes getting told what to do, but when you can think about it for yourself and what it means for you, it can be a real powerful way to decide, maybe this isn't for me.
Let's talk a bit about your research into medical marijuana advertising and how that's impacting teen use. What have you seen over the last few years as we've seen more states legalize?
Well, I think that's also a very interesting, right? Because every state has to make decisions about how they're going to advertise and what it's going to look like. And there's different rules and laws. And when this first came about in California, we were interested in it when it came on the ballot. And we've been following youth from 2008 as part of a longitudinal study that was funded by the National Institute of Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism. And now these youth are 24. So what we do is every year stuff happens and you're like, oh, we need to maybe add some questions. We need to think about this, like when e-cigarettes, like all these things. So we've been able to add things and look at it. And one of these was around advertising. What we wanted to see was over 7 years, when things were changing, what happened? And what we saw was a substantial increase, right, in the number of teens that reported seeing advertising. So being exposed, it increased from like 25% to 75%. So way more seeing it. And then we saw that when those were exposed, like that exposure was actually associated with cannabis use and intentions to use at this important key developmental period. And that work was used in LA County to actually think through ordinances around where this advertising was. And so some ordinances were put in place where you can't advertise now within 700 feet of where kids are going to be for schools, an example. And so I think that's what's really great about the work that we do, this community-based work and working at RAND, is just being able to impact public policy, being able to have these interventions like in primary care, that when all the grant money is gone, they're still implementing this in the primary care setting. And many of the settings I worked in, it's 15 minutes. You can talk to a teen in 15 minutes. And so really the work that I do is based on how can we develop these interventions for these organizations that they can do and we can train them to do that's going to fit in that setting when the grant money's gone. That's the way to be impactful, really.
I'm so surprised that seeing the advertising impacts the desire for them to use so much. Is it similar with alcohol? I know that tobacco can't be on billboards, right? But is it similar?
Yeah, it's similar for tobacco and alcohol. I mean, they've shown it for tobacco advertising, like with, there was a big study with when they had it for NASCAR and actually in the UK. And so we know that advertising affects the choices we make. And so a lot of our prevention program, particularly for like middle school age, right, when we see a lot of the substantial increases in use, is to talk about this. It's really, what are the ads telling you? What are they not showing? Everyone looks happy and they're drinking. If you were to continue that ad, what would it look like? And really, basically, ads want you to buy stuff, whatever it is. And so I think teaching teens to be savvy consumers of ads and understand better, like, oh, that's what this wants me to do. Well, maybe I don't want to do that.
Yeah.
I think that can be really powerful too. Again, it's about helping them think through their choices.
This is a new way of thinking I really wish was around when I was a teenager, like really empowering me to think like an adult. This is practicing for, it's not too many years away where you're going to have the keys to the kingdom and you can go buy whatever with your driver's license in your hand. You can go get whatever you want. So I like the idea of just trusting them to be smart enough to make a decision. Do you think that there should be forms of advertising that should just not be allowed for substances? Like, it's so very easy to see a billboard. You're driving down the highway, you can't help it. Is there some sort of like move that local government could make like that?
I think a lot of them have, and then I think some of it gets walked back. I think it's up to us as a community to really understand that these types of billboards and advertisements do affect the choices that our youth make. And are those the kind of choices we want them to make?
Yeah, very good point. Do you feel like teen rates of use might increase as we see legalization continue to happen?
Gosh, you're asking such great questions. And
they're
I think
hard, I'm sorry.
They are hard because, as we mentioned earlier, legalization looks so different in so many different states. So it's very hard to measure. I know a lot of people are doing amazing work around this. Dr. Bull Kilmer, who's at RAND, Dr. Rosalie Pakala, who was at RAND and now at USC, have been trying to look at this issue. And it's really hard because of how it's legalized. Because in some states it may be legal, but there's more restrictions. Like maybe you can't have billboards. So sometimes when you see these nationwide studies that say, oh, there's no effect, it's really hard to understand because in some states where it's maybe more lenient, there might be an effect, but in others where it's not, there might not be. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a patchwork.
You know? Yeah, I don't have an easy answer for some of these important but difficult questions.
It's kind of why I wanted to throw them at you. I want to see if we've come anywhere, but it's still like we just don't know. It's very different across the different states, and then there's even towns that have bans on certain things, and it's just difficult to see what it'll look like, I guess, as kids grow up for the first time, for the first generation. You know, I'm just a few years away from being able to go into a cannabis dispensary. Like, imagine being a teen right now. It's not going to be an easy choice, and they're still facing the same things all other teens are: peer pressure. And you know, we didn't have vapes or gummies readily available when I was a kid. We just had hash or bud, and that was it. And now they've got all these different choices, and I can tell that, you know, it's going to be a great pressure for teens right now to make these decisions. So the reason I wanted to do this episode in particular is for both kids and for parents to understand where we're at the moment, what we do know at the moment, and, you know, how to make good decisions off of that information.
I should say, we do know a lot. right?
Yeah.
We do know, like you said earlier, that advertising can affect the choices. And you brought up some other things, right? Edibles, there's all these other things out there and the way those are marketed. I mean, I'm thinking of the billboard I saw where the person is dressed as a superhero for gummies. I mean, that is targeting a certain age group. And so I think as parents, as a community, we have to think about whether we want that. And if we see that, how we talk to our teens about it or our kids, little kids that are going to see those billboards too, right? And that's why it's a continuing conversation to help them prepare so that they can make a healthy choice when they're exposed to it, which they will be. Everyone's going to be at some point. What you want them to do is feel prepared in that situation to say, no, this is not for me. My brain is still developing and I don't want to do this.
Oh, like parents don't have enough on at the moment. Now they got to discuss cannabis legalization with their 9-year-olds. Oh my gosh. Yeah.
Right.
Well, we very much appreciate your guidance on this. And I'm really interested in continuing to keep up with these studies and this kind of research. So hopefully we can have you back on a future episode and see how far we've come. So thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us.
Sure. And thanks for having me. And I really appreciate your great questions and very thoughtful. Like you said, I hope we can get more answers as we continue to learn.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. A big thanks to our guest this week, Dr. Elizabeth D'Amico of the RAND Corporation. Next week, we're going to be learning about the future of growing marijuana at home, thanks to a new artificially intelligent pot growing machine from Boundless Robotics called the Anaboto.
We have a camera in the system, and that's what's looking at how the plant is growing. If you have humidity or temperature issues, you can plug in a humidifier on the back and configure it, and then the machine will turn it on and off as needed. Oh, wow. So we have all sorts of sensors in there.
So it just goes so well with house decor. It just looks like a house plant with a lamp over the top of it.
It's Italian design.
You can follow us on social media at Different Leaf and at Different_Leaf, and I'm on social media at Brit the British. Make sure you're subscribed wherever you're listening to us right now and hit like and maybe even leave us a comment if you like us that much. Different Leaf, the magazine, is also now on the shelves at more than 1,600 newsstands across the US and Canada, including at select Whole Foods and Barnes & Noble bookstores. Go to differentleaf.com to buy any of the issues or to find the nearest spot that sells Different Leaf, the magazine, in real life. That's differentleaf.com.